It was a cold evening in New York City. The streets were alive with the usual rush. People hurrying home from work, neon signs flashing over crowded sidewalks, and the distant sound of car horns blending with the chatter of pedestrians. Inside a small, cozy diner on Fifth Avenue, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the warm aroma of sizzling bacon and buttered toast. Among the waitresses bustling from table to table, Emily moved with practiced efficiency. She had worked at Joe's Diner for nearly 3 years now, balancing trays filled with steaming plates, refilling coffee cups, and forcing a smile even on days when exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was a single mother trying to make ends meet. Her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was the light of her life, and every tip she earned went toward keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table. Life hadn't been easy, but she kept pushing forward, hoping for a better future. That night, as the wind howled outside and customers trickled in, a homeless man walked into the diner. His clothes were worn, his beard unkempt, and he carried a tattered backpack that looked as though it had seen years of hardship. The moment he stepped inside, the other customers turned to look at him, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disgust. Emily noticed the way the restaurant's owner, Mr. Johnson, stiffened behind the counter. He had a strict rule. No homeless people were allowed to loiter in the diner. But before he could say anything, the man quietly took a seat in the corner booth, his hands trembling as he unzipped his backpack. Emily hesitated for a moment. She knew she should probably ask him to leave. But something about him, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he clutched his backpack as if it were his last possession, made her pause. Instead, she grabbed a menu and walked over, offering him a warm smile. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" The man looked up, startled by her kindness. He swallowed hard, as if struggling to find the right words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Just a cup of coffee, please." Emily nodded, but as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. She had no idea that within the next hour, she would witness something that would change her life forever. Emily walked back to the counter, her mind still lingering on the man in the corner booth. She grabbed a coffee pot and poured a fresh cup, making sure to add a little extra warmth by placing it on a small saucer with a complimentary sugar packet. As she walked back to him, she noticed how he sat hunched over, as if trying to make himself smaller, almost invisible. When she placed the cup in front of him, his hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. He looked up at her with tired eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Emily offered him a small smile. "Would you like something to eat?" He hesitated, clearly embarrassed. I don't have any money," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Emily glanced toward the kitchen where Mr. Johnson was busy, making sure the diner was running smoothly. She knew the rules, no free meals. But something inside her refused to let this man go hungry. "It's on me," she said before she could stop herself. The man's lips parted in shock. I couldn't possibly." Emily waved off his protest. "It's just a meal. You don't have to pay me back." A deep sadness filled his eyes, but he nodded. "Thank you. A sandwich, maybe? Just something simple." She jotted down the order and quickly placed it in the kitchen. While she waited, she stole glances at the man, wondering what his story was. His backpack sat beside him, tattered and old. It was zipped up tightly, as if he was guarding something precious inside. He occasionally reached for it, his fingers brushing over the worn fabric before pulling away. Emily had seen many homeless people pass through the streets of New York, but there was something different about this man. Something almost familiar, though she couldn't place it. A few minutes later, she placed a warm turkey sandwich in front of him. He hesitated before picking it up, his hand still shaking slightly. The moment he took a bite, his shoulders sagged in relief, as if he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. As he ate in silence, Emily continued serving other customers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. It wasn't just his worn-out appearance or the way he clung to his bag. It was the sadness in his eyes. After finishing his meal, the man sat quietly, cradling his coffee cup between his hands. Then he slowly unzipped his backpack just a little, just enough for Emily to see something inside. A stack of papers, yellowed with age, and an old photograph peeking out. Emily's breath caught in her throat. That photograph, why did it look so familiar? Emily's heart pounded as she stole another glance at the photograph inside the man's backpack. She could only see a portion of it, but something about the image sent a shiver down her spine. It was old, its edges curled and worn, as if it had been carried around for years. She quickly looked away when the man zipped up his bag again, as if he could sense her curiosity. "Did you like the sandwich?" she asked, trying to mask her nervousness. The man nodded slowly. "It was the best meal I've had in a long time." His voice was softer now, filled with something that sounded almost like gratitude. Emily hesitated before speaking again. "If you don't mind me asking, are you from around here?" The man sighed and set his cup down. "A long time ago, yes. But those days feel like another life." His words carried a weight that made Emily's chest tighten. She wanted to ask more, but something told her that pushing too hard might make him retreat. A customer called for a refill, pulling her away from the conversation. As she worked, she kept stealing glances at the man, trying to piece together his story. Who was he? Why did he seem so lost? And why did that photograph seem so oddly familiar? Minutes passed, and the diner's usual afternoon lull settled in. The man remained seated, his hands resting on his backpack as if it held his entire world inside. Finally, Emily couldn't resist anymore. She grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and walked back over. "Would you like a refill?" He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he gave a small nod. "That would be nice." She poured the coffee, then took a deep breath. "I don't mean to pry, but I feel like I've seen you before. Or maybe that photo in your bag. Is it someone you know?" For the first time, the man's expression shifted into something unreadable, a mixture of pain and hesitation. He reached into his bag slowly and pulled out the photograph. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared down at it. The picture was old, taken in black and white. It showed a younger version of the man sitting on a park bench with a little girl on his lap. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with bright eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Emily's fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the photograph. "I know this picture," she whispered. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "You do?" She swallowed hard. "That little girl, that's me." The diner suddenly felt too quiet, as if the entire world had come to a halt. The man exhaled shakily. "I thought so." Emily's mind spun, memories flashing in fragments. A deep feeling of familiarity, the way the man had seemed oddly recognizable, the sadness in his eyes. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "You're my father, aren't you?" He nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Yes, Emily. It's me." Emily's hands trembled as she held the photograph, her mind racing. Her father, the man sitting before her, the homeless man she had just served a meal, was her father. How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Her father, Daniel, lowered his gaze, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if grounding himself. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said. "Not like this." Emily's breath came in short gasps as memories she had long buried began to surface. She had been just a child when he left. No explanations, no goodbyes, just an empty room where his presence used to be. She had spent years wondering why. Had she done something wrong? Had he simply stopped loving them? She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Where have you been all these years?" Daniel sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "It's a long story, Emily, and I don't expect you to understand, but I owe you the truth." Emily nodded, her hands still clutching the photo as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Then tell me, because I've spent my whole life wondering." Daniel inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I made mistakes that cost me everything." Emily felt her heart clench. She had braced herself for excuses, but his words carried no defensiveness, only regret. "I lost my job," he continued. "I tried to hide it from your mother, from you. I was drowning in debt, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't provide for you the way I wanted to. I was ashamed." He exhaled shakily. "One night, I left. I thought you'd be better off without me." Emily's hands curled into fists. "You thought we'd be better off without you?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what that did to us?" "To me?" Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes, but he nodded. "I do," he whispered, "and I've regretted it every single day since." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken pain. Emily looked away, blinking back tears. She had spent so many years hating him, resenting the ghost he had become in her life. And now, here he was, broken, lost, but real. A part of her wanted to walk away, to hold on to the anger that had kept her heart guarded for so long. But another part of her, the part that had once been a little girl waiting for her father to come home, wanted to understand. "Why didn't you come back?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now. Daniel hesitated before answering. "I tried," he admitted. "More times than you know. But every time I got close, I convinced myself you were better off without me. I didn't want you to see me like this." Emily studied him, his hollowed cheeks, the lines of hardship etched into his face. He was a shadow of the man she remembered, but his eyes still held the same warmth. Something inside her cracked. She wiped at her damp cheeks and took a shaky breath. "Where have you been staying?" Daniel looked surprised by the question. "Here and there. Shelters when I can. The streets when I can't." The thought of her father, her own flesh and blood, sleeping on cold pavement sent a pang through her chest. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Come with me." Daniel's brows furrowed. "What? I don't know what this means yet," she admitted. "And I don't know if I can just forgive everything overnight. But you're my father, and I can't let you stay out there." Daniel's lip quivered, and for a moment, he looked as if he might break down completely. He opened his mouth to protest, but Emily shook her head. "No arguments," she said firmly. "Let's go." Daniel hesitated, searching her face for something, perhaps permission to believe this was real. Finally, he gave a small nod. Emily exhaled, her heart pounding as she grabbed her coat. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her father was no longer just a ghost from her past. He was here, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Emily walked alongside her father in silence, the cold evening air wrapping around them. The city streets buzzed with life, cars honking, people chatting, but to her, everything felt distant, muffled by the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She stole a glance at Daniel. He looked exhausted, his frame frail, his steps slow. Seeing him like this made her stomach twist. He wasn't the strong, dependable father she had once known. He was a man who had lost everything, including himself. When they arrived at her small apartment, Emily hesitated for a second before unlocking the door. It felt strange bringing him here, letting him into her world after so many years of absence. But she pushed the doubt away. "Come in," she said softly. Daniel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cozy space. A small couch, a dining table with 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen. Simple, but homey. Emily suddenly felt self-conscious. Would he judge her life? Would he think she wasn't doing well enough? But when she turned to him, she saw something unexpected in his eyes, pride. "This is nice," he said. "You built this on your own?" Emily nodded, placing her bag on the counter. "Yeah, took a while, but I managed." Daniel gave a small smile, but it quickly faded. "I should probably clean up," he murmured, rubbing his scruffy chin. "I must look terrible." Emily hesitated before pointing down the hall. "The bathroom's there. Towels are in the cabinet." As Daniel disappeared into the bathroom, Emily sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. What was she doing? Could she really let him back into her life? The sound of running water filled the apartment, and she thought back to the years she had spent resenting him. The birthdays he had missed, the nights she had cried herself to sleep wondering where he was. But then, she thought about the look in his eyes when he saw her. The genuine regret, the pain of a man who had suffered just as much as she had. When Daniel finally stepped out of the bathroom, he looked like a different man. His face was clean, his hair combed back. He wore a fresh set of clothes Emily had dug out from an old box of donations. She offered him a plate of leftovers, and for the first time that night, he ate in silence, savoring every bite. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Emily looked up from her tea. "Do what? Help me," he said, setting down his fork. "I don't deserve it." Emily exhaled. "Maybe you don't," she admitted. "But I don't think I can live with myself knowing you're out there, struggling." Daniel nodded, but she could see the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Over the next few days, Emily helped Daniel in small but meaningful ways. She took him to a shelter where he could get proper assistance, helped him apply for aid programs, and even gave him a little cash to get back on his feet. He was hesitant at first, reluctant to take her help, but she insisted. One evening, as they sat in her apartment, Daniel turned to her with a serious expression. "Emily," he said, his voice firm, "I want to find work. I want to fix things." Emily's heart clenched. "Are you sure you're ready?" He nodded. "I have to be. I can't keep living like this." The next morning, Emily called in a favor at the diner. Her manager, a kind older woman named Linda, agreed to let Daniel work part-time doing dishes. When Emily told him, his eyes watered. "Thank you," he whispered. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Daniel started rebuilding his life. He worked hard, saving up what little he earned. He spoke to counselors at the shelter and began the process of finding stable housing. Emily watched in awe as he transformed. He was no longer just a broken man from her past. He was someone fighting for a second chance. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Daniel cleared his throat. "I know I can't make up for the past," he said. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your life again." Emily looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, she saw not just the man who had left, but the father who was trying to come back. Tears pricked her eyes, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. And just like that, a new chapter began. Months passed, and the changes in Daniel's life became more evident. He had secured a small but decent apartment through the shelter's assistance program, and his job at the diner, though modest, gave him stability. He saved every penny, determined to build a future he could be proud of. Emily watched his transformation with cautious hope. At first, she had been afraid that he would relapse into old habits, that his promises would turn to dust like before. But Daniel proved her wrong every single day. He was consistent, responsible, and, most importantly, he never took her kindness for granted. One evening, as Emily finished her shift at the diner, she saw Daniel waiting outside, holding a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. Daniel smiled, a nervous glint in his eyes. "Just open it." Emily carefully unwrapped the package and found a brand-new leather notebook inside. The cover was smooth, and her name was embossed in gold lettering. "I know you always liked writing," Daniel said softly. "Thought maybe you'd want to start again." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. As a child, she had dreamed of becoming a writer, filling notebooks with stories and poems. But life had been too hard, and dreams had been buried under the weight of survival. She traced the gold lettering with her fingers. "I don't know what to say." Daniel exhaled. "You don't have to say anything. I want you to know that I see you. I see the strong, kind woman you've become, despite everything I put you through. And I'm proud of you." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. Those were the words she had needed to hear for years, words she thought would never come. She hugged him, a real, deep embrace, the kind she never thought she would share with him again. "I'm proud of you too," she whispered. From that moment on, their bond began to heal in ways Emily never imagined. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still painful memories, but there was also hope. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that some broken things could be rebuilt. As they stood under the city lights, father and daughter reunited against all odds, Emily realized something profound. Sometimes, forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite it. And that, she thought, was the greatest gift of all.